As we've been telling you, millions of people will be watching Tuesday's presidential inauguration. Our chief political correspondent, Jeff Greenfield, has this viewer's guide.
What do you look and listen for at an inaugural?
The torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans.
Stirring words, of course, a panoply of pageantry, parades. But there are other things to note, some obvious, some subtle, some we don't even know about until the history is written. For instance, where does the inaugural take place? For 150 years, presidents were sworn in on the east front of the Capitol.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear.
But in 1981, Ronald Reagan moved the ceremony to the west front, facing not just the Capitol's famous monuments, but the nation itself. That move was a symbol as well of a sharp break in philosophy that had dominated political thinking for decades.
Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
Another question to keep in mind, who is the new president talking to?
This great nation will endure as it has endured.
FDR's famous 1933 speech was aimed wholly at his fellow American citizens, desperate for reasons to believe that utter calamity was not imminent.
Let all our neighbors know.
By contrast, Kennedy's 1961 inaugural was addressed almost completely to the world community, with a blend of tough resolve and the promise of cooperation.
Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate.
Then there are the silent dramas that so often take place. For instance, when outgoing vice presidents who have fought for the office and lost must sit and watch as their rivals take power. What was Richard Nixon thinking in 1961 as he watched the man who beat him by 1/10% of the vote become president? Or Hubert Humphrey 8 years later, who lost to Nixon by 0.5%? Or Al Gore, who got 500,000 more votes than George W. Bush? Or presidents who wanted and lost a second term as they become involuntary private citizens? We learned years later that back in '33, Herbert Hoover and FDR rode to the Capitol in pained silence, unable to have even the pretense of a civil conversation. And at least once, sharp observation actually inspired presidential action. In 1961, as John Kennedy watched the inaugural parade, he called over a young aide, Richard Goodwin, and asked him if he'd noticed anything about the honor guard from the Coast Guard Academy. There wasn't, Kennedy said, a single black face. Within a few days, the first steps were taken that led to the admission of the first black student ever to graduate from the Coast Guard Academy. That is yet another way to measure the distance we have traveled between that ceremony and the one we will witness on Tuesday.